Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. Once again, whenever we have Tom Caldwell on the show, there's lots to talk about. The chairman of Caldwell Securities Ltd joins us to discuss the state of the markets and the economy, with invasions, oil spikes, and inflation all taking their toll. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Tony.
I guess the first question is, what's your assessment of things going on right now?
There's a phrase that they use in economics that makes you sound very intelligent called endogenous shocks to the sea, that occur. Endogenous shocks makes you sound quite intelligent.
Yeah.
But it means we always have surprises. I remember a client said some years ago, "Well, call me when things are sort of calmed down and are normal." And I said, "We won't be talking again, because this is the world we live in." Although the invasion was a surprise to everybody. Nobody thought he would go this far. We have a view of the world that everybody's nice, and we can devote ourselves to Mickey Mouse issues, which we have been doing in the West. But we got this very shocking reminder that there is evil. People are evil. People have agendas. People do have territorial demands, and they're prepared to act on it, while the rest of us have got a little bit soft. So it was a shock.
Yes, it was. And oil is at $130 and climbing right now. What does this mean for Canadian producers and consumers, do you think?
Well, you're going to pay more for gasoline. There's a starter. I have an old pickup truck I drive, and I noted last week when I gassed, I put more money into my gas tank than I paid for my first car. Now,
Oh my gosh.
it wasn't a great first car. Let me start with that.
Yeah.
But, I guess if I had to use a phrase, it would be, what did you expect? What do people expect? I mean, mercifully, as everybody started to disinvest, the climate change crew, they really worked there. And by the way, you can now see who was really behind this and who benefited from this. When everybody was starting to get out of the oils, one of the things I remember from my undergraduate economic days is, if you cut the supply and the demand stays the same or goes up, guess what, kids? The price goes up. So I did, I sound like I'm patting myself on the shoulder, but, I did buy a lot of the oil and gas stocks at that period of time, which is presented to the funds that I manage pretty significant gains. Because what do you expect? Now, you're not only had this cutting of supply, or cutting of investment money going in, people disinvesting, selling these companies, but now you have this shock. And the thing about wars is they destroy things. They destroy purchasing power. They drive inflation. They waste people, and they waste commodities, and they waste everything. It's the most wasteful human endeavor there is. And so all this metals start to go as well. Where you're going to use, steel, copper, nickel, everything. It's all going to be part of the equation. So you got inflation right across the board, but you have it in that linchpin of our society, energy.
Right. And also, we've been talking on the program as well, Tom, about Russia being the #1 supplier of wheat in the world, and Ukraine being the #5 supplier of wheat. So
Yep.
It's not just about oil and gas, although that's a preeminent thing in people's minds right now, but there might be some other things coming down the pipe too, right?
Very, very much so. But you can have realignment in commodities too.
Mm.
For example, if they can't sell their wheat to us, they got a pretty big customer right in their doorstep in China. So you're going to see realignment of commodities. You're going to see inflation across the board. And I always keep saying, any buffoon can start a war or a conflict, but nobody never quite know how they're going to end up.
Right.
Not only it goes for military conflict, but also conflict in, for example, in these sanctions. Now, I see our prime minister very wisely declared an embargo on Russian oil coming into Canada, and that was a courageous step, given the fact we don't import any Russian oil into Canada.
Yeah.
But at any rate, it kind of looks good on paper, which is really all we spend our time doing. But we are going to see this permeate. And for example, everybody wants to go to electric cars. Well, electric cars use nickel and lithium. One of the biggest nickel producers, of course,
Right.
is also Russia. So we don't know in these sanctions what the ripple effect is going to be. We've got a pretty good idea. It's going to be inflationary big time.
Exactly. We're going to continue our discussion with Tom Caldwell. He's the chairman of Caldwell Securities Ltd. After this brief break. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. We're talking to Tom Caldwell of the Caldwell Securities Ltd. He's the chairman. Tom, Russia is a pariah state now. 250 companies have shut down their operations within the borders of Russia. What's your take on the impacts of all this? I guess we have been talking about this, but it just goes so far beyond. Like sanctions is almost a term that we've gone well beyond sanctions right now. So give us your thoughts on this.
First off, sanctions are a little bit like going into a bank and putting a gun to your own head and saying this is a holdup. Everybody is suffering. Now, the Russians are going to suffer, and they're being told a different story. And there's a little bit of embellishment, not only on the Russian side, but there probably is on our side too. But be that as it may, they're going to see it in the, somebody said they won't be able to get a Coke or a Big Mac. I don't know that that's a big sacrifice to that society, but it really is having an impact, but it's going to have a cost impact to us as well. So that it's not painless. I mean, I was thinking, we were talking about energy prices. If the Canadian government, for example, cared about Canadians beyond ideology, one of the first things you do right now with this spike up is get rid of the carbon tax. We don't need that money to go buy windmills or solar panels at the present time. Canadians are, the average homeowner is paying $50 to $80 a month of carbon tax, not only to mention what you're paying on your gasoline tax. So if they want to ease the blow for Canadians in inflationary, never mind interest rates, because they aren't going to impact this type of inflation. Do something with leaving more money in the consumer's hand, get rid of the carbon tax. That would be a starting point if you cared. And that would really, I think, go a good distance to helping the average Canadian. $50 a month to me or you probably not make a big deal of difference, but there are a lot of people who will make a difference to it.
Well, and indeed, there's going to be there's a projected to be another hike in the carbon tax on April 1st, right?
Well, but that's unconscionable.
Yeah.
It's just unacceptable. It's because himself in Ottawa wants to meet some Paris Accords, which are no longer relevant in the world that we live in now. Energy security and reasonable cost is. And if we cared about the environment, we would have a big LNG plant, liquid natural gas plant in British Columbia, and one, by the way, in the Maritime, so we could supply China, replacing coal, which is environmentally friendly, right. Or we've been able to supply Germany and Europe in lieu of the Russians. So that's environmentally friendly. But there have been pressure groups, and I think funded by outside actors, standing in the way of these things for years. So it's amazing that we would charge more to Canadians for energy at a time when prices are spiking. And you think the government recognized that if anybody thought about it for 2 or 3 minutes or thought about Canadians.
One of the things that I found perplexing in the last few days is all this talk about replacing, in the U.S., replacing Russian oil and gas. I guess they were doing about $5 billion a year of purchasing from Russia. That's going to stop, and yet President Biden has shown no indication he wants to reestablish the Keystone XL pipeline, turn to Canada for the replacement oil and gas. He's talking to Venezuela, he's talking to Saudi Arabia, but he doesn't appear to be talking to Canada. Did you find that frustrating as well?
I think it's bizarre. If you look at the newspaper coverage or the media coverage, we're doing it. I mean, they're going to do a deal with Iran so they can free up Iranian oil as well. Mm-hmm. So you wonder why. And there's not been a mention of Canada in this at all. They're talking about drilling more in the States, etc. I guess the thing is, with all due respect to politicians of every stripe, politicians never admit they're wrong. Nobody ever comes on and say, God, did I make a mistake there? I'm terribly sorry. But the concept of scrubbing the Keystone pipeline, that's 900,000 barrels of Canadian oil, cheap, into America every day. Solves the problem. In fact, we can solve much of it with existing pipeline capacity. But it really showed how vulnerable America made itself because of an ideology or the new religion of climate change, whatever. It's amazing, but I don't think President Biden can say, I made a mistake. I won't say it, but I don't think he even tacitly do it by even mentioning Canada, because if he mentions Canada, immediately Republicans and the rest of them will go to a Keystone pipeline as a really dopey move on his part.
It would have been nice to have Justin Trudeau as a salesperson for our oil and gas sector too, right?
I don't know. I don't know many companies that would hire him to do anything.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll leave it at
I
that.
think my bias is showing here, Tony.
I think that's fine. That's what it's all about. We got to keep it real here at Boom and Bust. We're not going to censor anybody. And
That's good.
Tom Caldwell is our guest today. He's the chairman of Caldwell Securities Ltd. We're having a great discussion here about the state of the markets and the state of the economy. We're going to take another brief break. We'll be back after that break. Please stay with us. What about Europe? I mean, we were talking about, getting onto the climate change agenda, and Europe was winding down nuclear facilities in Germany and moving towards renewables, but yet they had this addiction to Russian oil and gas. Do you see that changing now?
I think there'll be a lot of verbiage about changing it. They're bringing coal-fired generating back on stream. Reactors, once you deactivate them or stop using them, it takes some time to get back online. To build a new one takes 10 to 15 years. It's a big project. If I had to guess, I think they'll say we're going to stop using Russian oil. This is terrible, et cetera, et cetera. When this thing gets settled out in any way it does, I think you'll see much of Europe tiptoeing back into importing Russian oil and basically not talking about it too much. I think, the reality, and I think Putin did his math. He knows what the dependence is. I think he knows they eventually have to come back, and they will to some degree.
So because it's so really with Putin in power, it's so unreliable. He could turn off the tap at any moment if he doesn't like what you're saying, right?
It's pretty hard to get into that man's head, but he's probably eminently practical. And I don't think he would do something unless he had an agenda. Well, sometimes in this matter, it's hard to understand his agenda, but he does have an agenda. Some people say he's going a little bit whippy, but I don't know. Maybe that's just part of the rhetoric that goes along with these conflicts. But he always has a reason for doing. I don't think he'd have them off for no reason at all.
I've got a question a little bit out of the blue, but I wanted to tap into your experience a little bit. Do we have a problem of Russian oligarchs in Canada? And the reason I ask that is, London, UK has the unofficial title as Londongrad, and there's something like there's hundreds of billions of dollars of investments by Russian oligarchs in London property, London football teams, you name it. Do we have a similar situation in Canada to your knowledge?
Generally speaking, that crew is fairly quiet unless you get, the fellow owns Chelsea Abramsky or whatever his name is. I think they're here very definitely. I mean, there's probably a good number of houses up in the bridle path and may well be owned by some of those gents. This money from these oligarchs is spread all over the world. We see the conspicuous consumption in hundreds of millions of dollar yachts, that sort of thing. But it's here and it's invested because clearly the money has to spread all over the world. There's also been some thinking that this oligarch money, it isn't really theirs, that these are markers from Putin himself. I don't know whether that's true, but we can be pretty well confident that some of that money is in Canada, directly, indirectly, under nominee names. But I would say, yes, it's here. Is it a problem? I don't know.
Do you think that Canada is doing all that it can and should be doing when it comes to sanctions against Putin and Russia?
Well, basically, we don't have a lot of leverage. In the world scene, we're a bit of a bit player. So we don't do a lot of trade with Russia, really. We're more competitors with Russia in commodities and foodstuffs and that sort of thing. So it's not that we have leverage. Even in defense, there's not much we can provide. Sending 3,500 troops to the Baltic countries means absolutely nothing. It's all symbolism. So we are not a player that means anything to anybody. It's really most of what we do there is for domestic consumption, what Canadians think, that sort of thing. It's banning them from flying over Canada. That's a real thing. That would hurt them because as planes go this great circle route, generally speaking, Russian aircraft will have to fly over. Canadian airspace. So that's a real thing. But I don't know of much beyond that.
I guess what we need to know now is the long-term effects of all of this. I know it's hard to say because we're just at the front end of this crisis, but I'd love to get your point of view. We've got about 30 seconds before the break, and then we'll take the conversation into the next part.
Well, let's take near term first. Near term is you're seeing markets wildly volatile. I mean, market's up 750 points right now. It's down massively. I have two concentrations in the portfolios I run: energy and financial services. And it's really funny, they go in opposite directions. So basically my performance each day looks pretty good because I'm getting killed in one and the other one's going through the ceiling. Today, for example, the energy stocks are down and my financials are way up. So it's the market is trying to adjust and it can't, because all these theories are bouncing around.
Hold that thought. We'll continue the conversation. Please stay with us. Tom, we're back. Just to continue on with your thought about near-term issues and then longer-term issues.
Okay. I think longer term, it sounds kind of bizarre, but there's going to be quite a few positives in this. We've seen the supply chain problems some months prior to this. Now we're seeing that what we thought was dependable is not dependable, particularly in commodities and raw materials. This is going to lead in some measure to an investment boom in manufacturing, in raw materials. People are going to be, I think, if their governments are thinking, be a little bit more open to investing in commodity production, mining, etc. So I think you're going to see a lot more investing in each domestic economy. So I think that's something that can be a positive coming out of it. The negative ongoing will be inflation for a period of time. And I don't know that central banks raising interest rates are going to help, because it's raising the cost of money, which needs to be reinvested to reallocate our supply lines. And that, I don't know that particularly helps. This is not demand inflation, although it isn't the housing market, but that'll take care of itself. The housing market will top out eventually and sort of tumble in a little bit on itself. So I don't think that's something we can do a great deal about if we do anything artificial. Inflation long-term in the underlying stuff, it will probably slow down the electric vehicle production type of thing because of raw materials required for that until other supply sources are found. And clearly it depends on the outcome. Mr. Putin is very determined to achieve his goals. I think he's probably looking a little bit bad to the extent that he can in that environment that he controls. But I think he's got to push this thing through, sadly, with all the torment that it's causing people, particularly in the Ukraine, but elsewhere. So I think he has to stick at it. How this thing gets resolved, it's got to be. Ariel Sharon, Israel's general, years ago had a great line: sooner or later, you got to talk to your enemies. They got to sit down and carve out a deal, and whatever it looks like. And to me, a good deal is where everybody feels they were slightly cheated. That's generally a fair deal. So nobody's going to get exactly what they want. He thinks he can get what he wants right now, but as time goes on, his position gets worse and worse. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. So inflation is going to be a factor. Investment in alternate sources of supply is going to be a factor. And I think some of the sanctions are going to be rolled back a bit, particularly Europe and energy, as we talked about, because they need it and we can't get alternatives quick enough. So I think some of them will ease a bit. At least that's my general overall view at the present.
Yeah, I was struck by what you said earlier that the interest rate hike by the Bank of Canada really will not have the intended effect, right? Because it's supply side inflation rather than demand side, I suppose.
Absolutely, but I do think 0.25%, that sort of thing, doesn't mean anything. The banks feel they're doing something. Remember, central banks are not a royal priesthood. These guys are politicians like anybody else. Powell is. They're very much affected by things. They might have an increase down there, but I don't think they're going to be as aggressive about increases as they were talking about, say, a month or so ago. So we're going to see them, but I think they're going to be very small, very tentative, and very slow in doing it because they don't want to cause more aggravation than we got going right now in this economy.
Oh, so like the uncertainty that is added into the mix because of Putin and Russia and Ukraine means that their original plan of maybe another quarter point in the next segment may not happen. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, I think a quarter doesn't make any, that looks politically correct. It looks as if you're doing the right thing.
Right.
But you're really not doing very much to impede. But any significant move, we were talking about a 50 basis point and then 7 increases over this year. I think they're going to take it step by step because this inflation, as you correctly said, is a different type of inflation. It's not a demand. It's basically supply being curtailed. So that is not impacted by interest rates. In fact, it's exacerbated by interest rates because the cost of capital has increased.
Lots to chew on there. Tom Caldwell, thanks for joining us today. He's the chairman of Caldwell Securities Ltd, talking about the impacts of Ukraine, the invasion there, and inflation and oil and gas. There's a lot going on. We do value your presence here once a month. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you. Another excellent discussion with Tom Caldwell, chairman of Caldwell Securities, about the whole scene. Obviously, lots of impacts due to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but we've got our own issues as well with inflation and cost of living, all of those things. So we'll continue to have him on the program. Thanks for watching today.